Hello there. Tonight, as the wind hums softly through the gaps in your windowpane, and the distant sound of a neighbor's plumbing reminds you that modern life, for all its flaws, at least includes indoor toilets, I invite you to slip back in time. Way back. Back to a time of scratchy wool, itchy hats, and absolutely no texting. We are heading to the high Middle Ages, a time when dating wasn't so much a romantic pursuit as it was a tactical family merger involving goat's honor and at least one suspicious cousin. So go ahead, dim the lights. Make yourself a cup of something warm, but not too exciting. Perhaps a weak chamomile or some tepid water that once sat near a mint leaf. Wrap yourself in a blanket, or better yet, several layers of linen wool and existential dread. And let's ease into this story together. Imagine waking up in a village where the streets are unpaved, and so is your love life. It's early spring, and the mud is beginning to thaw. The air smells faintly of damp moss and whatever the neighbor's pig had for breakfast. Our setting is a modest manor nestled in the middle of rural nowhere. The courtyard, which might once have been gravel, is now mostly a puddle. A chicken walks through it with the confidence of someone who's never been turned down at a dance. Inside the great hall, things are waking slowly. A fire coughs softly in the hearth, and an elderly servant with a lopsided gait is trying to rekindle the flame using damp straw and harsh language. The stone walls are decorated with several faded tapestries and a smell of wet dog. And somewhere, a girl of approximately marriageable age is staring out a tiny, fog-smeared window. Her name is Isolde. She is 17, which in medieval terms means she's already behind schedule. Her family, the honorable and mostly upright House of Wexley, has been trying to secure her a suitable husband for the past 2 winters. Unfortunately, the Wexleys are not what they used to be. Their last pig died during a thunderstorm, don't ask, and their best field now produces only cabbages, with a strange lean to the left. As for Isolde, she is clever, literate, and inclined to speak her mind, a charming trio of traits that make her less than ideal by the standards of the time. Her mother, Lady Wexley, once described her as an asset, provided one squints. The marriage market is, shall we say, sluggish. Eligible bachelors in the region include Edwin of Bogmarsh, a young man who owns 3 oxen and once bit a monk, Sir Aldrich the Smudged, whose family crest is a spoon and whose breath reportedly wilts daisies, and Thomas, the cooper's son, who is technically of no noble birth, but owns a surprisingly symmetrical face. Unfortunately, romantic feelings are not part of the process. In fact, they are generally regarded as suspicious. Love is a topic for troubadours and poor people with nothing to inherit. Instead, marriage negotiations are based on more practical factors, land dowry connections, and whether anyone nearby has recently died and left behind something valuable. Isolde has very little say in any of this. She spends most of her days embroidering things she does not care about and pretending not to overhear her parents discuss her future like she's a surplus goat. "Edwin might be the best we can do," her father mutters over his porridge one morning. He's strong. His last wife only screamed a little. Her mother replies. "What about the one with the spoon crest? At least his coat of arms is clean." Meanwhile, Isolde dreams of something else entirely, not dramatic passion or wild adventure, just a conversation, a stroll, perhaps someone who knows the difference between a turnip and a radish. But this is not that kind of time. Outside, the sun breaks briefly through the clouds, highlighting the slush that coats the village square. A cart rumbles past, pulled by a donkey who looks like he's reconsidered all of his life choices. Isolde sighs and returns to her sewing. Today's task, a handkerchief bearing the family crest, an angry duck. And so begins our journey. 20 stages of slow-moving, moderately uncomfortable, historically inspired courtship. A tale of muddy roads, suspicious gifts, and whispered negotiations over tepid ale. Don't worry, nothing very exciting will happen. You can relax now. The day after Isolde embroidered the final thread into the angry duck crest, a gesture that felt less like artistic expression and more like a quiet surrender to fate, the Wexley household received an unexpected visitor. He arrived just after second breakfast, a time that in truth was not marked by any food, but simply an emotional hunger for something resembling excitement. The man was thin, in that particular medieval way that suggested both experience and a long-standing feud with bread. His cloak was soaked, his boots were mismatched, and his scroll was tied with a string that may once have belonged to a cat. This was not unusual. What made him notable was the smell. It wasn't offensive, exactly, just concerning. A sort of moist parchment and smoked eel aroma that clung to him like a devoted fan. The Wexleys, being both noble and polite, at least when sober, welcomed him into the great hall and offered him a seat on the slightly less broken bench. Lady Wexley pressed a cup of something vaguely herbal into his hand, while Lord Wexley stared at the man's teeth with growing curiosity. "You are a matchmaker, then?" Lady Wexley asked, her voice cautious, as though hoping the man might turn out to be a tax collector instead. "Indeed," the visitor replied, unrolling his scroll with dramatic flair that was somewhat diminished by the wet splat it made against the table. "I am Osbert, the well-connected, formerly Osbert, the slightly employed. I carry with me a list of eligible men, each more marginally acceptable than the last." Isolde, seated nearby under the guise of mending a sock, did not look up, but her needle paused, hovering just above the heel, as if waiting for confirmation that things were in fact about to worsen. Osbert cleared his throat in action that produced a surprising amount of steam. "Now let's see. You are seeking a match for a daughter. Age, 17. Lady Wexley replied briskly, 17 and full of potential." "Very good," Osbert murmured, scribbling something into the damp margin of his scroll. "And the family estate, still above the waterline." "Yes, mostly Lord Wexley grunted. There was some flooding near the duck shed, but it's been shored up with optimism and a rather sturdy goat." "Excellent, excellent. Now I have several candidates who may suit your daughter's unique energies. Shall we begin?" Osbert then began to describe each potential suitor with the same enthusiasm one might use to describe a collection of damp spoons. First was Bertram of East Ditch, a young man with a strong back, few teeth, and an appreciation for onions. His family owned several middling cows and a dog that obeyed commands, half the time provided the moon was right. Second came Humphrey of Mudfen, a pious fellow with aspirations toward minor clerical work and an unfortunate habit of quoting sermons in casual conversation. Third was Lionel the Younger, who had no known estate, but did possess a truly enviable mustache and a deep affection for riddles involving barnyard animals. At this point, Isolde's sock developed a sudden and suspiciously large hole. "Are there any," she said, very quietly, "who can read?" Osbert blinked, as though someone had asked if any of the suitors had wings. "Read well. I believe one of them once saw a letter. From a distance, through a window." Isolde returned her gaze to the sock, which was beginning to resemble a fishing net. Lady Wexley, sensing her daughter's impending rebellion, or at least a sarcastic remark, that might cost them another suitor, quickly interjected. Perhaps we should arrange an introduction. Something subtle? Osbert nodded. A village fair is approaching, is it not? They always provide a suitable backdrop for awkward glances and misjudged flirtations. Lord Wexley muttered something about boiled eels and the rising cost of cheese, but it was generally understood as approval. Plans were made. Letters would be sent. Arrangements would be arranged. And Isolde, sock in hand, returned to her room, where the only eligible bachelor was a particularly judgmental goose painted on her wall, hanging. The next day dawned with a drizzle that could barely be bothered to fall. It simply hovered like an indecisive sneeze misting the village and making the air taste faintly of wet bark and potato. Preparations for the fair began in earnest. Tents were erected with rope that groaned like disgruntled ghosts. Ale was brewed in vats that probably hadn't been cleaned since the last time anyone had a reason to smile. Musicians tuned their instruments with the care of men who suspected they would not be paid. And Osbert the well-connected disappeared back into the fog, promising to return with at least one potential husband who could walk upright and form a sentence. Maybe. Isolde, meanwhile, spent the afternoon pretending to choose a dress. Her options were limited. One was brown and itchy, the other was slightly browner and slightly itchier. Both smelled faintly of cabbage. She chose the one with fewer buttons missing. As she looked at herself in the cracked shard of mirror above her washbasin, she wondered not for the first time if it was truly better to be married to a man who didn't beat you, or to remain unwed and become the village eccentric who spoke to ducks. Her mother knocked on the door. "You'll need to smile, dear," she said. "Not too much. Just enough to suggest health." Isolde nodded slowly, then practiced an expression that suggested she might be capable of joy, provided it didn't require speaking. Outside, a cart rumbled past carrying firewood, and one of Edwin of Bogmarsh's oxen, which promptly sneezed on a cabbage seller. The fair would begin tomorrow, and with it, a parade of suitors, smells, and suitor-related smells. Isolde closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and tried to remember the last time she had looked forward to anything. It may have been a particularly good bowl of soup. She wasn't sure. Downstairs, Osbert's soggy scroll still lay on the table, gently steaming beside a bowl of lentils. One name near the bottom was circled twice, and beneath it, in faded ink, was written the phrase, "Better than nothing." And so, the stage is set. Not for romance, certainly not for joy, but for something resembling forward movement, possibly involving turnips. Morning came, not with bird song, but with the unmistakable clank of someone dropping an entire stack of pewter mugs into a barrel of cider. The fair had begun, and like all great events in the medieval calendar, harvest festivals, saints' days, and spontaneous goat births, it arrived with more enthusiasm than organization. Isolde stood near the edge of the square beside a crate of slightly bruised apples and a stall advertising mystery pies with a sign that leaned ominously. She wore the brown dress with 3 buttons and the faint smell of root vegetables, her hair hastily braided and decorated with a ribbon so faded it may have once been red, or simply embarrassed to be pink. Her mother was nearby, casually adjusting the angle of her daughter's shoulders, as though arranging a sack of grain to look more symmetrical. "Posture, dear," Lady Wexley whispered, "and for heaven's sake, don't frown at the cheese vendor again." Isolde tried to look agreeable without looking too available. The line between marriageable and desperate was as thin as the gravy at the meat pie tent. Around them, the fair was bustling in that slow, muddy way that only medieval crowds could manage. Children ran past carrying candied roots on sticks. A juggler dropped a turnip onto his own foot with a muted grunt. And somewhere near the ale cask, two men were already arguing about whose pig was more pious. The smell was a complex blend of livestock, smoke, roasted onions, and ambition. Then, with the subtlety of a man who had never once been subtle, Osbert, the well-connected, emerged from between two stalls, looking far too pleased with himself, and holding a folded parchment, like it contained the secret to eternal marriage. "Ah, there you are," he beamed, adjusting a hat that did not belong to him. "I've secured not one, but two introductions, both upright, mostly coherent, and both with their own teeth, at least the important ones." Isolde blinked. Her mother beamed. Her father, sitting nearby with a suspicious sausage roll and a mug of what might have been mead or regret, grunted in vague approval. Osbert, ever the master of ceremony, cleared his throat and waved enthusiastically toward the edge of the crowd, where a man in a velvet doublet, several sizes too large, was squinting at a loaf of bread, as if it had just insulted his lineage. "This," Osbert announced, "is Alric of Windmere. He owns a mill, 3 geese, and a rather tragic poem about a pond." Alric stepped forward, clutching the bread like it was both a gift and a shield. He had kind eyes, a strong chin, and the expression of someone deeply afraid of eye contact. "My lady," he said, offering the loaf, "I bring bread." Isolde accepted it cautiously. It was slightly warm, slightly burnt, and shaped like a lopsided boot. She nodded politely. "Thank you. It's bread." "It is," Alric replied, clearly proud. "I made it with barley. Some of it was intentional." The conversation limped forward. He asked if she liked walking near trees. She asked if he knew any letters beyond his initials. He admitted he once wrote a receipt for hay, but then misplaced it and blamed a goat. They stood in awkward silence until a nearby dog began barking at a puppet show, giving them both a reason to look elsewhere. Osbert clapped his hands once, not unlike a falconer, summoning a particularly unimpressed bird. "Well done. Very natural. Now let's try bachelor number 2. Enter Lionel the younger." The mustache arrived first, curling around the corner of the tent, with the confidence of a man who had waxed it, using both boar fat and inherited arrogance. Lionel wore a doublet covered in buttons, many of which were decorative, and none of which were fastened correctly. He strode up to Isolde with the air of a man who had once seen a play and believed it was a documentary. "Milady," he began bowing with theatrical flourish, "what has 2 thumbs, an affection for riddles, and a keen appreciation for embroidered poultry?" Isolde blinked again. "You—" "Correct," he said, pointing at himself with both thumbs and nearly knocking over a basket of pickled beets. "May I compare you to a summer's pig, for you are fair and likely to sunburn." Her mother inhaled sharply through her nose. Her father took a large sip of possibly mead and looked skyward. Osbert murmured something about unique charm and stepped back like a man retreating from a slow-moving landslide. "Do you enjoy riddles?" Lionel asked, adjusting his sleeve with unnecessary drama. "Here's one. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at midday, and ends up married by dusk if Osbert has his way?" Isolde smiled tightly. "A desperate noblewoman." Lionel blinked. Then he laughed loudly, awkwardly, and a little too long. "Wit, I adore it. You must meet my aunt. She thinks pigeons are spies." Just then, a trumpet blared near the center of the fairground, signaling the start of the turnip toss competition. A crowd began to gather. Lionel clapped his hands and declared he would compete in her honor. Alric, not to be outdone, quietly placed his bread on a barrel and followed. Osbert whispered that a little rivalry was healthy, so long as it didn't involve knives or family curses. Isolde, left alone, for a brief and glorious moment, stared down at the loaf in her hands. It was still warm, still boot-shaped, and somehow still the most sincere thing anyone had handed her all day. Behind her, someone was shouting about a turnip violation. In the distance, a lute hit a sour note, and above all of it, the scent of smoke ambition and vaguely hopeful desperation lingered in the air like perfume at a poorly ventilated feast. Isolde sighed, tucked the bread under her arm, and turned toward the crowd, forming at the contest line, because apparently her future might depend on who could throw a root vegetable the farthest without dislocating something important. If romance had ever been likened to a vegetable, the Middle Ages surely chose the turnip, humble, lumpy, and capable of mild injury if hurled with enthusiasm. The annual turnip toss was not originally intended as a courtship ritual, but over time, like many things in medieval life, plague cures, pig blessings, and the wearing of hats. Indoors, it had drifted into the realm of social performance. For young men of a certain status, this was their moment to shine, or at the very least to demonstrate their upper body strength without causing lasting damage to livestock. Isolde stood just beyond the chalked line where the contestants gathered, still clutching the now slightly squished boot loaf from Alric. The crowd was thick with expectation mud, and at least one small child selling roasted onion peels on sticks. Osbert, the well-connected, stood beside her, adjusting his hat, with the subtle desperation of a man who feared both rain and rejection. "Now watch," he whispered with theatrical urgency, "for this is where destinies are forged, or at least bruises sustained." Alric stepped up first solemn, as a monk clutching his turnip with both hands, as though it were a sacred relic. His brow furrowed in deep concentration, lips moving silently in what may have been prayer, or simply a list of muscles he hoped wouldn't cramp. With one deep breath and a low grunt, he hurled the turnip forward. It arced high, performed a small and entirely unintentional spiral, and landed with a soft thud, just short of the herbalist's goat, who seemed unimpressed. A polite smattering of applause followed along with a few approving nods from nearby farmers who recognized a solid toss when they saw one. Alric turned, wiping his hands on his tunic with modest satisfaction. Isolde gave him a small nod of acknowledgement, something between respect and the expression one might give to a neighbor who successfully repaired a fence. Then came Lionel the Younger. He strutted to the line, pausing to bow toward Isolde, then toward the turnip itself, which he held aloft like a misunderstood prophecy. "Ladies and gentlefolk," he called, addressing a crowd that had not asked to be addressed, "prepare yourselves, for I shall launch this humble root with the grace of Apollo and the precision of a particularly poetic archer." Someone in the back shouted, "Just throw it, Lionel." He adjusted his sleeves, kissed the turnip dramatically, prompting a small gasp from a nun, and launched it. The toss was magnificent in its commitment, and questionable in its trajectory. The turnip soared twisted midair, like a drunk pigeon, and landed directly in a bowl of soup at the nearby stew tent. A stunned silence followed, broken only by the soft plop of the root vegetable submerging beneath lentils. Lionel turned triumphantly, arms raised. "Art," he proclaimed, "unexpected, provocative, wet." Isolde did not applaud, though she did exhale through her nose in what might have been amusement. Alric looked mildly alarmed, mostly because he had also ordered soup from that tent earlier. Osbert, trying to maintain the spirit of the occasion, shouted something vaguely encouraging, and made a note on a small scrap of parchment that immediately blew away in the wind. Other villagers took their turns. Some hurled with practiced skill, others with reckless abandon. One man managed to hit a spinning wheel booth, and another accidentally launched his boot instead. But none seemed to command quite the same audience as the two hopefuls now circling the crowd like socially awkward hawks. Eventually, the turnip toss concluded with no clear winner, though the stew vendor demanded compensation, and Lionel offered a limerick in place of coin. As the crowd began to drift toward the pie table, Isolde found herself flanked by both suitors, each determined to escort her somewhere vaguely romantic, or at the very least less muddy. Alric cleared his throat. "Perhaps you'd care to walk by the mill stream," he offered, shifting the weight of his bread-free hands nervously. "It's slightly less pungent this time of year." Lionel interjected with a sweeping gesture. "Or perhaps a song beneath the willows. I know a lovely ballad about a fish who longed to dance." "Perhaps," Isolde said slowly, "I might walk to the pie tent, alone." The men hesitated, unsure if this was a test, a jest, or simply a clear boundary, stated in an era that didn't often value such things. "I do appreciate the bread," she added to Alric. "And the performance?" she said to Lionel, unsure whether to categorize it under music sport or interpretive confusion. She turned and walked away, leaving behind two young men, a mildly damp Osbert, and the lingering scent of airborne root vegetables. As she reached the edge of the crowd, the fair shifting now toward dusk with its flickering lanterns and slightly more aggressive cheese merchants, Isolde felt something unusual, a brief moment of peace. Not joy exactly, but a temporary reprieve from expectation. She bit into the bread. It was dense. It was slightly salty. It was oddly comforting. Somewhere behind her, a lute struck a sour chord, a goat bleated in protest, and Osbert began loudly promising another round of introductions, possibly involving a baron's third cousin with excellent handwriting. Isolde kept walking toward the dimming sky, the smell of pie, and the next entirely uncertain chapter of her matrimonial misadventure. By the time Isolde reached the pie tent, the crowd had thinned slightly, replaced by a loose formation of elderly villagers, one unusually tall child, and a merchant with a tray of candied leeks that no one wanted, but everyone politely sniffed. The air was thick with the scent of stewed meat, overcooked berries, and the unmistakable undertone of ambition disguised as pastry. The pie tent itself was modest canvas flaps, pinned back by sticks, a table covered in cloth that had once been white, and a chalkboard announcing the available options. Meat unspecified apple suspiciously crossed out something called Festival Surprise, and a fourth option that had simply been labeled No Questions. Isolde stood in line behind a man who wore two hats and seemed deeply invested in a disagreement with himself about whether turnips counted as a dessert. She waited patiently, chewing the last of Alric's bread, which had gone a bit stiff at the edges, but was holding up better than her general outlook. Behind her, the sounds of the fair carried on laughter, bartering a pig, making a break for the cabbage booth. Somewhere, Lionel was likely trying to rhyme Isolde with boulder, and Alric was possibly apologizing to the soup tent again. The woman running the pie stall had the focused energy of someone who had been awake since before sunrise and was now being held together entirely by dough and resentment. Her hair was pinned back with what might have been knitting needles, and her apron had enough flour on it to start a minor avalanche. Next, she barked, wiping her hands on her skirt and eyeing Isolde like a suspect ingredient. What'll it be? Isolde hesitated. Is the festival surprise Sweet, the woman snorted. It's not moving, if that's what you're asking. Had a bit of everything. Pear onion, maybe gooseberry. Hard to say now. Isolde nodded. I'll have that then. And one of the no questions, please. The woman grunted approvingly and scooped 2 modest slices into a rough wooden dish, handing it over with the air of someone gifting both nourishment and mild hazard. Spoons in the barrel, she added, gesturing to a bucket that may have once contained apples or possibly fish. Isolde found a cleanish spoon and carried her pie dish to a small bench near the edge of the tent. It was occupied only by a man playing something that sounded like a bagpipe but looked more like a sleeping cat attached to bellows. He nodded politely, and she nodded back. She took a bite of the surprise pie. It was complex, sweet in places, sharp in others, and featuring an unexpected crunch that might have been an almond or perhaps an assertive seed. The no-question slice was softer, saltier, and had an aftertaste that reminded her of church candles. Neither was unpleasant. Both were warm. She ate slowly, letting the unfamiliar flavors distract her from the even more unfamiliar feeling that she was expected to choose a husband based on airborne vegetables and facial hair. As she chewed, a small voice interrupted her thoughts. Is your bread a gift or a warning? Isolde looked up to see a boy of about 9 staring at the remainder of Alric's loaf, which sat on the bench beside her, like a forgotten sidekick. A gift, she replied. From a suitor. The boy squinted at it. Looks like a shoe. It tastes better, she said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. You can have it, if you like. The boy snatched the loaf with the speed of someone who had been raised around chickens and distrust. Thanks, he chirped and disappeared into the crowd, presumably to barter it for something less bread-shaped. Isolde finished the last bite of pie and leaned back slightly, listening to the tent flap rustle in the breeze. A man tripped over a crate nearby. Someone dropped a ladle. The sky was shifting to that dull medieval gray that meant rain or melancholy, or possibly both. Osbert reappeared, then his boots caked with something questionable, and his hat, now decorated with a feather that might have once belonged to a decorative pheasant or an aggressive broom. There you are, he said, breathless as always. I found another potential suitor. Very promising. Slightly deaf, but he has excellent posture and owns a herd of unusually obedient sheep. Isolde raised one eyebrow. I'm eating. Yes, of course. Finish your pie, Osbert said, sitting down beside her without invitation, and immediately knocking over the spoon barrel with his elbow. But afterward, I think you should meet him. His name is Thaddeus. He speaks 3 dialects of complaint, and he hasn't sneezed once all year. Isolde stared at her now empty dish. Osbert, do you know what I want? He looked at her blankly. A stable roof. Punctual feasts. Perhaps a man who knows the difference between a frog and a toad. No, she said softly. I want 5 uninterrupted minutes without someone trying to marry me off like surplus barley. Osbert blinked. Is that negotiable? She stood, brushing crumbs from her dress. Tell Thaddeus, I'm very happy for his sheep, and that I wish him well. Osbert opened his mouth, then closed it again, clearly uncertain whether to object or simply recalculate his strategy. I'll let him know, he muttered. Isolde stepped out of the pie tent and into the cooling air of early evening. The fair was beginning to dim. Lanterns were being lit, casting golden light on muddy boots and crooked teeth. Somewhere music played, slightly off-key, slightly too fast the way hope often sounds when it's trying too hard. She walked slowly past the jugglers, the stews, the patch of grass where someone had dropped a wheel of cheese and left it for fate. The pie settled warmly in her stomach, the taste of odd fruit and stubbornness lingering on her tongue. She did not know where she was going exactly, only that it wasn't toward Thaddeus, or Alric, or Lionel, or even Osbert, and his soggy scroll of matrimonial forecasts. She was not done walking. Not yet. Not until she reached something less temporary than a fairground and more solid than a bread shaped like a boot. The lanterns had been strung from the crooked poles earlier that day by a boy named Wymond, whose only real qualifications were height and a complete lack of fear of ladders made from questionable rope and older ladders. They now swayed gently in the evening breeze, casting uneven circles of golden light onto the trampled earth and the hems of dresses that had long since surrendered their battle with cleanliness. Isolde walked slowly along the outer edge of the fair, where the music thinned out, and the smells shifted from fried dough and boiled onion to damp hay and tired wood smoke. Her feet made soft sounds against the mud, the kind of squelch that told you exactly how far you were from anything paved. In her pocket was the handle of the pie spoon she had forgotten to return, and in her mind was the quiet ache of someone who had spent an entire day being offered to strangers like a mildly dented soup tureen. The path ahead was lined with lanterns that had once belonged to the monastery, borrowed years ago for a harvest feast, and never quite returned. Some were square, some round one, shaped vaguely like a fish, and all of them flickered with that sleepy determination only firelight can muster. They illuminated the faces of people passing by, lovers leaning into each other, with practiced whispers, merchants packing up unsold wares with the resigned grace of men who knew they would try again tomorrow, and children half asleep in their parents' arms, sticky with pie filling and indecision. Isolde kept walking, her pace measured, but aimless her thoughts, drifting between the fair and the farm, between obligation and appetite, between the things she was supposed to want, and the quiet refusal blooming slowly somewhere near her ribs. She passed a tent where a fortune teller sat half asleep behind a curtain of beads. The woman opened one eye, looked directly at Isolde, and said, "You smell like onions and defiance," before returning to her nap. Isolde paused only long enough to smile and move on. Behind her, Osbert was likely searching the stew line with a fresh proposal and an even fresher handkerchief. Ahead of her, the lantern path curved gently toward the edge of the village, where fields began and the world got quieter. She found herself near the fence that marked the border between the fairgrounds and old Thomas Henwick's sheep pasture. The fence had been rebuilt so many times, it resembled a collaborative art project between termites and sleep-deprived carpenters. She sat on the top rail, which creaked, but did not immediately collapse, a small mercy. Beyond the fence, the pasture stretched out under the darkening sky. Sheep were small shadows in the distance, their bells occasionally chiming like lazy wind chimes. The moon, not yet full, but trying its best, cast a pale light over everything. It was peaceful in a way the fair had not been. No announcements, no suitors, no Osbert, with his scroll of increasingly improbable bachelors. Just grass and sky, and the distant whisper of someone failing at a lute solo. Isolde breathed in, held it, and let it out slowly. The air smelled of moss and the end of a long day. She hadn't meant to come this far. She hadn't meant to walk away from her mother's hopeful smile, or her father's quiet grunts of support, or even the strange camaraderie of the pie tent. But she had. And now, here she was, sitting on a fence, holding a stolen spoon, and wondering how many other girls had done the exact same thing across all the other fairs and festivals in all the other villages, each one wondering if maybe, just maybe, they were meant for something slightly different than what everyone expected. A rustle came from nearby. Not alarming, just the sort of rustle that happens when someone isn't very good at walking quietly through grass. Isolde turned her head slightly and saw a figure approaching. Slowly, hands tucked into sleeves, the posture of someone either thoughtful or cold, or possibly both. As the figure stepped into the lantern light, she recognized Alric. His hair was damp with evening mist, and he looked both nervous and apologetic, like a man who had followed a woman only far enough to apologize not to intrude. "You left your scarf," he said, holding out a small bundle of fabric she didn't realize she'd dropped. "And I thought you might want it before the fog settles in." Isolde looked at the scarf, then at Alric, then at the scarf again. "Thank you," she said, not taking it just yet. "I needed air. I suspected," he said, standing a polite distance away. "I'm not very good at turnips or words or—" "This," she echoed. "This," he repeated, gesturing vaguely toward himself. The fair, the entire medieval courting system, with one awkward motion. Suitors. Talking. Being impressive without being irritating. That sort of thing. Isolde finally took the scarf. It was slightly damp, but still warm in the center. She folded it over her lap and said nothing for a long moment. "You weren't irritating," she said finally. "You brought bread. You didn't make me guess the moral of a goose poem." Alric smiled faintly. "The moral was don't trust feathers." "Exactly," she said. They sat in a silence that wasn't quite comfortable, but wasn't strained either. Just space, shared and quiet and allowed. After a while, Alric said, "I should go. The fair will pack up soon, and your Osbert will worry I've stolen you. He'd probably charge you a fee," she said. Alric laughed softly, nodded, and turned back toward the fair. Isolde watched him go until he became another shadow among shadows. Then she looked down at her scarf, the spoon in her pocket, and the pie settling in her stomach, like a promise she hadn't agreed to. She stood, stretched, and began to walk, not toward the fair, not yet, but along the fence where the lanterns still flickered gently, and the night didn't ask anything of her, except that she keep moving forward. The lantern light grew sparser the farther Isolde walked, each one behind her, giving way to longer stretches of cool shadow. And the kind of stillness that made you feel like the world had temporarily paused to let you think without interruption. The fence at her side shifted from half-repaired to fully speculative, the rails, no longer straight, or even convincingly attached to one another. Occasionally, a sheep would glance up from chewing to observe her progress, their expressions unreadable in the way that only livestock can manage. The mist had begun to settle across the grass like an uncertain curtain, curling low and clinging to her ankles, with every step soft and damp, and slightly theatrical, as though the evening had decided to put on a show for no one in particular. The scarf in her hand, the one Alric had returned without pretense or pun, now rested over her shoulders, the dampness fading into the cool air, and taking with it the last of the pie warmth from her skin. She adjusted it absently, her mind wandering down a dozen different paths, some practical, some philosophical one, entirely preoccupied with the question of whether marriage always involved so many root vegetables. The field curved gently toward a low hill at its far end, where the boundary between pasture and woodland blurred into a lazy scatter of trees. The kind that grew sideways when the wind insisted, and dropped leaves in small, stubborn piles, even when it wasn't quite time for autumn. Isolde had never walked this far from the village at night before. Not out of fear, there were few dangers this close to home, aside from mildly territorial goats, but because there was rarely a reason to. Most evenings were spent at the hearth, or beside a basin, or around a table, piled with whatever the garden hadn't decided to rot that week. Wandering was for bards travelers, and people who didn't have obligations, thick as porridge. But tonight had already slipped sideways from normal, the kind of evening that wasn't quite rebellious, but didn't feel obedient either. A gentle refusal. That was the phrase she kept circling back to. Not defiance, not escape, just a quiet stepping aside, a pause in the expected. Somewhere behind her, a horn blew faint and festive, signaling either the beginning of the last dance or the end of the stew, depending on who you asked. She imagined Osbert scribbling something about her sudden absence into the margins of his scroll, muttering about eligible farmers while repacking his feathered hat. She imagined her mother smoothing down her apron with unnecessary vigor, politely explaining to someone that her daughter was likely around somewhere and just needed a breath of fresh air and doesn't usually vanish unless there's a cow involved. The thought made her smile, then fade. The hilltop offered a better view of the village, twinkling firelight, the occasional glint of a torch being waved too enthusiastically, and the outline of the tents now drooping like tired flags. The fair was winding down in earnest. Merchants were haggling backward to avoid packing their wares. Children were being located and washed. Musicians were doing that final number that feels like 3 separate endings stitched together with hopeful flourishes. And the pie tent had finally stopped smoking. She sat on a flat stone beneath a crooked tree that looked as though it had once tried to grow tall, changed its mind halfway, and settled instead for charm. The branches above her swayed gently, whispering the kind of thoughts you can't quite hear unless you're not trying to listen. Isolde leaned back slightly, stretching her legs across the grass, her fingers tracing patterns in the mist as it drifted around her shoes. There were no suitors here, no expectations, just the soft hum of wind through tired leaves and the faint buzz of late summer insects trying to finish whatever their business was before the season folded in. She thought about Alric, not in the dramatic way stories encouraged, with hearts and flutters and declarations shouted beneath balconies. More like a quiet curiosity, a man who didn't ask for anything and brought bread without metaphor, who offered a scarf and didn't follow it with an argument, who laughed gently and stood back when needed. It was strange, in a way, to find someone so entirely unremarkable, and yet so refreshingly kind. Lionel had vanished in a puff of gestures and self-congratulation. Thaddeus, she assumed, was still somewhere, complaining about weather in multiple dialects. But Alric had simply returned a scarf and gone. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She wasn't sure she needed to do anything with it. Maybe that was the point. A rustle from the underbrush startled her, followed by a low bleat and the sudden appearance of a sheep with the unfortunate look of someone who had just remembered where they were supposed to be 2 hours ago. It blinked at her slowly, then wandered past without judgment. Isolde watched it go, then leaned back on her hands and exhaled into the mist. The village would miss her soon. She knew this. Not dramatically, not with shouts and torches, but with the slow accumulation of questions and furrowed brows, and eventually the quiet approach of someone sent to retrieve her. Probably her cousin Elfrida, who had once followed her into a ditch, purely out of obligation. She wasn't trying to avoid returning. She just wasn't ready to arrive yet. The air was shifting now, cooler, heavier, the kind of night that warned of dew on everything by morning. She could hear the faint clang of a cart being loaded, the clop of hooves, the echo of someone shouting about lost mittens, or love, or possibly both. The fair would be gone by sunrise. All that would remain would be a trampled field, a few bent nails, and half a turnip someone forgot to take home. Tomorrow would be regular again, predictable, full of suggestions and lists, and another awkward meal with someone who claimed to like ducks. But for now, there was this moment. A hill, a crooked tree, and the knowledge that sometimes simply not choosing was its own kind of choice. She closed her eyes and let the night carry on without her for a little while longer. The moon had tilted itself a bit higher into the night, as if craning its pale neck to better view the crooked patch of pasture where Isolde still sat, feet, stretched out scarf tugged snug around her shoulders, and eyes half closed beneath the occasional twitch of a falling leaf. The quiet had deepened not ominously, but in the way a loaf cools after baking, gradually, inevitably, with a hint of steam, still lingering if you lean in close. The sheep had not returned, possibly off to rejoin its flock, or file a quiet complaint with the nearest shepherd. Isolde hadn't moved much since it left, except to shift once when her elbow found a sharp stone under the grass, and again when the breeze decided to get particularly involved with her left ear. She was beginning to feel the first gentle pins of cold in her fingertips, the sort that came not with urgency, but as a polite suggestion that maybe soon she should consider heading back. Not now, of course, but soon. She let her eyes wander to the horizon, where the last embers of sunset had long since faded, replaced by the soft spatter of stars. They weren't especially bright, thanks to the lingering smoke from the village fires, but they showed up anyway, like distant guests arriving late and without gifts. Somewhere to the east, a fox barked once perhaps at the moon, or an unruly beetle, and somewhere much closer, a familiar crunch of footsteps came from the path below the hill. Isolde didn't tense, didn't rise. The night was still too gentle for alarm. Besides, she recognized the rhythm, slow, careful, a little uneven on the right side, a gait that suggested someone who either thought too much or carried a slight limp depending on the humidity. Moments later, Alric stepped into view, his boots damp with dew, and his expression somewhere between sheepish and speculative. He didn't speak immediately, which Isolde appreciated. He simply nodded toward her, and then toward the empty space beside the rock where she sat, the unspoken question dangling like a scarf on a peg. She nodded in return. He sat slightly less gracefully than he'd probably intended, and adjusted his sleeves with the slow deliberation of a man who didn't quite know what to do with his hands. For a few moments they sat in companionable silence, the only sounds being the soft crunch of settling leaves and the far-off murmur of someone extinguishing lanterns with more enthusiasm than accuracy. "You're not hiding," Alric said at last, not a question, but something that had wanted to be one. "Not exactly," Isolde replied. "I'm just not there. I understand," he said, picking a blade of grass and twisting it in his fingers. It was a loud day. "Loud and sticky," she added, "and everyone wants to marry me off to someone who either brings poems or poultry. Not both. Surprisingly, no. He chuckled, soft and brief. My mother used to say that love should feel like good bread, simple, warm, and something you miss when it's gone. And does it? I wouldn't know. I mostly make it not feel it. Another silence followed, longer this time, but not heavy. The kind of silence that can only exist between two people who have nothing urgent to prove to each other. Isolde stretched her legs out further, her boot brushing against a fallen branch that gave way without complaint. They'll wonder where I've gone, she said. Eventually. They'll assume you found a better offer, he said, and then added, which you might have. There's a traveling spice merchant with both eyebrows and a steady cart. She snorted. Tempting, but I've heard he sings to his pickled plums. They're an appreciative audience. She turned to look at him fully for the first time that evening. He didn't flinch or fidget, just looked back, steady and unblinking. Not intense, not insistent, just present. Why are you here? She asked. Not accusing, just curious. You could have gone home, or stayed with the others, or whatever men do when they're not trying to throw turnips impressively. Ulrich looked at the horizon for a long moment, then back at her. Because I wanted to know if you were all right, and because I figured someone should sit with you if you wanted company and not conversation. That's a rare offer. So are hilltop seats, with a view of nothing and everything. She smiled, barely, but it stayed longer than her usual expressions of polite interest. Her eyes drifted skyward again, to the stars, now slightly more bold in their flicker, and the moon still watching, like an over-invested aunt. Do you think, she said slowly, that it's possible to just choose quiet for a while? Not make decisions. Not leap into the next thing. Just be. Ulrich considered, then nodded once. I think so. Not forever, but long enough to know when you're choosing something and when it's choosing you. They sat with that thought, letting it settle between them like a shared blanket. The mist was rising again, thicker, now brushing against their knees and collecting in the hollows of the ground. The night wrapped itself around them in gentle, wordless layers, like a story that had lost its urgency and decided to meander instead. The fair was nearly done. The village would sleep soon, and Isolde, scarf around her shoulders and damp grass beneath her, wasn't quite ready to leave the hill. Not yet. Maybe not for a little while longer. Just long enough for the stars to rearrange themselves, for the silence to stretch its limbs, and for two people to sit together, with no intentions louder than the breeze. The fog thickened the way a stew does when left to simmer too long, quietly, gradually, until you look up and realize the spoon now stands on its own. It crept in over the pasture and around the trunks of the scattered trees, not maliciously, but with the sort of slow determination that suggested it had a schedule to keep. It muffled sounds, softened edges, and gave everything a faintly unfinished look, like the world itself had paused midway through painting the evening. Isolde remained seated, scarf now wrapped higher around her neck, her fingers idly toying with the fringe as she listened to the fog build. Beside her, Ulrich hadn't moved much either. He had shifted to sit cross-legged on the grass elbows, on knees, eyes tracking something in the distance that may have been a tree or just a particularly committed shadow. Neither of them spoke for a while. Not because they had nothing to say, but because there was nothing pressing to voice. The kind of silence they shared now was its own sort of conversation, one made up of shared breath and nearby presence, a gentle affirmation that nothing urgent needed tending. The village Once a warm glow of flickering lanterns and music now looked like a child's drawing erased halfway. Lights blinked faintly through the mist, but offered no details, and the sounds of the fair laughter, clatter, the occasional accusatory goose had dwindled to mere suggestion. From this far out, the fair could have been a dream already packing up. "Do you suppose," Alric said eventually, voice low enough to blend with the fog, "that anyone's ever gotten lost this close to home and decided to stay lost on purpose?" Isolde tilted her head, not toward him, but toward the question. "I think plenty have tried," she said, "but most forget to bring a blanket or a second pair of socks." He smiled into the mist. Practicality, the death of many a poetic impulse. That's why poetry's best left to those who don't have to wake early for bread making and scarf mending. Exactly. The air had cooled more sharply, now nudging them gently towards the notion of movement. Isolde shifted her weight slightly, drawing her knees closer, arms looped around them as the chill collected in the folds of her dress. Her eyes wandered the pasture again, now a field of gentle shadows and vague impressions. Somewhere to the left, a sheep bleated with mild disapproval. Alric, noticing her movement, leaned to one side and pulled something from his pocket, a small cloth bundle tied with rough string. He untied it, revealing 2 squat, slightly wrinkled apples. "I traded for these earlier," he said, holding one out. "Not for courtship, just because I like apples more than parsnip pudding." Isolde accepted the fruit with a nod. It was cool to the touch and dappled like it had spent a life dodging hailstorms. She bit into it carefully. It was tart, more skin than flesh, but satisfying in the way only something unpretentious could be. "Thank you," she said after a moment, "for not offering it with a sonnet." "I considered it," he said, mock solemn, "but I'm afraid all I know are rhymes about cheese." They ate in quiet, the sounds of chewing barely louder than the rustle of wind through low branches. The fog was nearly complete now, wrapping around their hill like a quilt stitched by sleepy clouds. "Do you think," Isolde said between bites, "that everyone in the village will marry someone? Because it's time, not because it's right." Alric didn't answer immediately. He took another bite of his apple, chewed thoughtfully, then said, "I think most people don't believe there's a difference. They're told when a bread is ready, when the crop must go in, when to kneel, when to stand. Choosing love, that's not usually on the list. But it should be. It should. But it's inconvenient. Doesn't respect schedules or dowries." Isolde finished the last of her apple and tucked the core gently into the grass, letting the earth hold on to it. Alric did the same, brushing his hands on his tunic with a sigh that wasn't exactly weary, but definitely familiar. "Do you ever think about not marrying?" she asked, then immediately added, "Not just out of stubbornness, but really, what if it's not needed?" He considered, then shrugged, not dismissively, but as if balancing something invisible on his shoulders. "Sometimes I think it would be simpler, other times lonelier. But mostly, I think I'd rather not do it wrong than do it fast." Isolde nodded. "I wish more people said that. We're taught to nod before we think." A gust of wind stirred the mist, sending a ripple across the field, like the surface of a pond, revealing then hiding the same clumps of grass and distant fence posts in gentle succession. Isolde stood slowly brushing off her skirt, then looked down at the damp imprint left on the stone where she had sat for what felt like both a moment and a lifetime. Alric stood too carefully adjusting the satchel over his shoulder and stretching his legs with a quiet wince. "They'll think we wandered off together," he said lightly. "They'll assume all sorts of things." "Let them," Isolde said, wrapping the scarf more snugly. "We haven't done anything scandalous, except eat apples and question expectations. That's practically revolutionary." "Then we'd better walk slowly," she said, beginning down the hill. "Give the rumors time to settle in." Alric followed his steps quiet beside hers as they descended into the thicker mist. Behind them, the crooked tree stood watch, and the night wrapped in fog and thoughts left unfinished waited patiently for whatever came next. Their descent from the hill was less a walk and more a careful navigation through a damp cloud with ambitions. The fog, now fully committed to its role as evening's chaperone, had thickened into something between weather and suggestion. It muffled each step, swallowed the outlines of familiar trees, and blurred the path into something that might once have been a road, or perhaps a particularly enthusiastic rut. Isolde led slightly, if only because the folds of her skirt were already damp, and she reasoned that wet knees were better than muddy elbows. Alric kept pace beside her, his usual rhythm muted by the soft give of earth underfoot, and the occasional squelch that punctuated their journey like a subtle drumbeat of inconvenience. They didn't speak right away. Words seemed almost unnecessary in the hush that surrounded them, the kind of hush that pressed gently against your temples and invited your thoughts to wander out without shoes. The only sounds were the distant bleating of sheep, now safely reassembled, if slightly judgmental, and the occasional snap of a twig that suggested a squirrel regretting its life choices. Isolde could just make out the village lanterns, now blurred into blobs of amber and orange, the way firelight does when viewed through tears or steamy windows or the gauze of early morning dreams. It didn't look like a place bustling with expectation anymore, just a series of sleepy cottages curled around green windows, aglow doors, probably creaking, and people inside finishing mugs of something warm and entirely too herbal. She breathed deeply, the air tasting of moss, wet wool, and faintly overcooked onions. "Do you think," she said, after a time, "that if you pretend long enough to be interested in marriage, it starts to seem like your idea?" Alric glanced at her, the fog blurring his expression into something kind and unreadable. "Maybe. Or maybe pretending just teaches you how much of yourself you're willing to hide." That sounds like something Osbert would say if he ever paused long enough to think. He's too busy selling destinies by the pound. They reached the edge of the pasture, where a crooked gate leaned into a post as if exhausted by decades of being half-functional. Isolde paused, resting her hand on the damp wood, and looked back up the hill. The tree was barely visible now, a shadow lost in a deeper shade of shadow. "I'm not sure I want to go back in," she said. "Not yet. You could circle the long way," Alric offered. "Go past the mill. Pretend you were looking for a shoe or a particularly elusive duck. I already have a reputation for wandering. Might as well give them something to wonder about." They passed through the gate, the hinge squealing with the enthusiasm of a seldom used violin. The lane leading back to the village was lined with hedgerows, now heavy with dew, their edges catching the lantern light like tired sequins. A toad somewhere nearby made a noise that sounded both philosophical and disappointed. They walked in easy silence for a while, their feet moving more from memory than vision. The path narrowed, where the stones gave way to worn dirt, and Isolde had to sidestep a puddle that seemed to stretch on forever. Alric helped her over a particularly treacherous patch by offering his hand, which she took, not because she needed to, but because it felt easier than explaining why she hesitated. His fingers were warm, slightly calloused, the kind of hand that had needed more than dough, and probably once rescued a kitten from something ill-advised. She let go before she had time to overthink it. "You know," Alric said, after another stretch of steps, "I think this might be the first time I've walked home with someone and not had to impress them." "You brought apples," Isolde reminded him. "And you didn't rhyme once. That's impressive enough." "A low bar, but I'll take it." They neared the outer edge of the village, where the first houses slouched contentedly behind their small fences and unambitious gardens. The lane split here, one path winding toward the green, where the last of the fair had dissolved into crates and forgotten shawls, the other leading past the bakery, and on toward the row of homes where Isolde's family occupied their ever-so-slightly leaning hall. They stopped at the fork fog curling around their feet, like a pet that didn't want to be left behind. "This is where I pretend I wasn't wandering aimlessly," she said. "And I pretend I was delivering apples with great purpose. We're very convincing." Alric smiled the kind of smile that didn't stretch wide, but settled comfortably just beneath his eyes. "Good night, Isolde." "Good night, Alric." She watched him turn toward the bakery, his figure gradually absorbed by the mist, until all that remained was the soft echo of steps and the faintest suggestion of a scarf swaying. She turned toward home, heart, quiet mind, still wandering just a bit ahead of her. The fog closed gently behind her, like a page being turned, and the village exhaled into sleep. The walk from the fork to Isolde's home took less time than she expected, though perhaps that was the nature of fog, making distance feel softer, muffling time until you arrived somewhere without quite realizing how you'd gotten there. Her boots left wet outlines on the cobbles, leading to the small gate, which hung slightly askew, as if it were bowing to her return. The hall itself loomed gently in the dark, its timbers weathered by rain, wind, and decades of being leaned against by gossip. A single candle flickered behind the far window, suggesting someone had remained awake, or at least had left the light on, in case of news visitors or late-arriving pies. Isolde pushed open the door slowly, the hinge sighing in greeting, and stepped into the familiar scent of warmed hearthstone herbs, hung too long above the lintel, and something vaguely edible left simmering far past its prime. The room inside was modest table benches, a loom with a half-finished pattern of indeterminate theme, and a hearth with the last licks of flame curling like cats too lazy to leave. Her mother sat at the table, her hands folded, her expression one of a carefully constructed calm that suggested she had already imagined 3 scenarios involving Isolde, 2 involving runaway livestock, and 1 featuring a well-meaning blacksmith. "You're late," Lady Wexley said, without looking up from her hands. "And damp," the fog, Isolde replied, removing her scarf and hanging it on the peg by the door. "It has a tendency to cling. So do rumors." A silence fell between them, not quite heavy, but padded enough to suggest more might follow. After a moment, Lady Wexley stood and crossed the room with the quiet precision of someone who knew where each floorboard creaked and chose them on purpose. She reached for the kettle by the hearth and poured water into 2 clay mugs, dropping dried mint and what might have once been apple peel into each before setting them on the table with a gesture that meant, "Sit now and explain gently." Isolde took the seat across from her, wrapping her hands around the mug, even though it was still too warm to hold comfortably. They sat like that for a while, mother and daughter, steam rising between them, the quiet filled only by the occasional crackle from the fire. "You left with a scarf and returned with a story you haven't told," her mother said at last. "That's usually Osbert's pattern, not yours." "I didn't leave Isolde," said then, corrected herself. "I wandered. I needed air and company eventually." Her mother didn't press, but she did sip her tea with the sort of deliberation that meant her mind was already 6 steps ahead, constructing timelines and potential family alliances, like a chess game with livestock instead of pawns. "Alric?" she asked, finally, her voice neutral. "Yes, he's sensible. He brought me bread, then apples, no poetry. That does rather narrow the field." Isolde looked down into her mug, watching the leaves swirl gently slow and aimless. "I don't know what I'm supposed to want," she said, "only that I don't want it to be decided by a vegetable toss or a matchmaking scroll." "What you're supposed to want," Lady Wexley replied, "is a good name, sturdy children, and someone who doesn't borrow money from the miller. What if I want quiet, then marry a man who snores softly and keeps his tools organized? Mother, Isolde." They both smiled then slightly, the way people do when they've agreed to disagree in a room small enough that disagreement echoes. From the back room came a soft thud, likely her father shifting in his sleep, or the cat knocking over a basket again. Her mother stood collecting the mugs, rinsing them in a bowl with water that had long since gone cold. "You don't have to choose tonight," she said without turning. "But if you linger too long in not choosing, someone else will do it for you. I know. And if Alric brings you anything pickled, it's probably his mother's idea, not his. I'll prepare accordingly." With that, her mother nodded and disappeared into the narrow hallway, leaving Isolde alone with the fire, the last traces of mint, and her thoughts that had begun to arrange themselves in quiet rows, like a garden not yet planted, but ready. The coals in the hearth gave a final pop, sending a tiny ember skittering across the stone. Outside, the fog leaned against the door, like a guest too polite to knock. And inside, Isolde stood slowly, removed her boots, and moved toward her small room at the back of the hall, where the window opened onto the orchard, and the sheets still smelled faintly of lavender and lint. The window in Isolde's room was small and uneven, the kind that let in just enough light to find your shoes, but not enough to know if they matched. It opened outward on a rusted hinge that squeaked precisely once each time it moved, as if announcing that air had been granted permission to enter. The breeze that filtered through now was more suggestion than wind, cool and damp, and scented faintly of apple bark, distant chimney smoke, and something else, lavender perhaps, or the memory of it. Isolde leaned on the sill, arms folded chin, resting lightly on her wrist as she stared into the haze. Her view consisted mostly of the orchard, or rather the shapes that hinted at it. Trees stood like sentinels, barely sketched in their branches, softened by fog and time, and the fence that circled them looked more like a fading line in an old book than anything meant to keep animals out or fruit in. The fog, persistent and fond of lingering, clung to everything, like an old story, refusing to end, in the silence of her room, broken only by the occasional creak of beams settling into the weight of night. Isolde allowed her thoughts to drift. Not toward decisions, not yet, but to all the small, quiet moments that had unfolded over the last day, how the bread had tasted faintly of sage and something sweeter, how the pie had defied expectation and logic, how Alric had stood beside her in a misty field without asking for anything more than her company. She had not realized how rare that was until now, not just the absence of demands, but the presence of quiet. There was something deeply strange about a man who didn't fill the air with his importance. She sat back, slowly pulling the thin wool blanket around her shoulders, then slipped under the covers that smelled like drying herbs and once washed linen. The pillow was small, slightly lumpy, but comfortingly familiar in its imperfections. The mattress shifted beneath her, like it remembered her shape and was resigned to welcome her back. Sleep, however, was not as obliging. It hovered just out of reach, a reluctant guest waiting for the right lull in conversation before it arrived. Her eyes closed and opened again, not fully, but enough to remind her they weren't ready to settle. She turned onto her side, facing the wall, where a small crack had been steadily widening since last winter, forming the vague shape of a duck, if viewed in the right light. Her fingers traced the edge of her blanket, pulling it higher, lower, then back again. Somewhere beyond the orchard, a dog barked, once a short, confused sound, as if surprised by its own opinion. Isolde exhaled slowly, willing her thoughts to still, but they refused to be corralled. They wandered instead, looping through half-formed futures and remembered conversations. She thought about her mother, so practical and firm, yet soft at the edges, in the quiet ways, how she always knew when to brew tea, without asking how her advice came wrapped in sarcasm, but rarely in judgment. She thought about Osbert, somewhere likely making diagrams or compiling new candidates from visiting merchants and the more literate sons of minor nobility. She pictured him explaining how Alric ranked third in modest assets, but second in emotional steadiness, and how that might shift if he acquired a second cow or learned to dance without scaring poultry. And of course, she thought about Alric, not in the dramatic, swoon-worthy way that ballads insisted upon, but with a sort of slow-turning curiosity. He had said little, but his silences were never empty. They carried the weight of consideration of choosing when to speak and when not to, and that alone felt like a relief. She wondered if he was also awake now, staring at a ceiling with too many thoughts and not enough wool. The night deepened around her, the fog outside pressing gently against the glass as if listening the orchard lost to it, now entirely. Her breath slowed. Her fingers, once restless, curled loosely under the blanket. She was not yet asleep, but she had stopped resisting its approach. Somewhere in the stillness, between waking and dreaming, between the orchard and the cracked wall, a thought settled at the edge of her awareness. Not a decision, not quite, but something close. A shape in the fog. A direction, not a destination. She turned again, pulling the blanket over her shoulder, and letting her eyes rest finally, her mind drifting not into plans, but into possibilities, gentle and unresolved. The morning did not so much arrive as gently seep into the room, filtering through the wavy glass of the small window in a manner more suggestive than commanding. The fog had not entirely left it, rarely did, but had retreated just enough to reveal outlines again. The trees of the orchard stood in loose rows like half-awake sentries, their leaves twitching in the mild breeze, their fruit hanging with a kind of resigned expectation. Isolde opened her eyes slowly, not because anything demanded it, but because the light had shifted enough to suggest that pretending to sleep any longer might be more effort than it was worth. She lay still for a few more breaths, allowing the weight of the blanket, the creak of the rafters, and the distant cluck of a particularly decisive hen to reintroduce her to the day. When she did finally rise, it was with the slow stretch of someone not in a rush to be useful. Her feet found the cool floorboards. Her toes wiggled as if reacquainting themselves with gravity, and she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders before opening the window with a soft grunt and a quiet mutter about stiff hinges. The air outside was cool and damp, with that just-baked smell of soil morning, and something faintly yeasty drifting from the bakery a few doors down. A bee wandered past her nose, undecided about its purpose, and the trees rustled in a manner that suggested they had opinions, but were too polite to voice them before noon. She stepped outside with her shoes only loosely tied, and her hair braided in the haphazard way that meant she intended to redo it, but never quite would. The path to the orchard was familiar, the stones worn smooth by years of boots' rain, and the occasional tumbling cousin. She walked slowly, pausing once to move a snail from the center of the path to a more promising leaf, and again to investigate a particularly enthusiastic mushroom that had decided to sprout in the shape of a questioning eyebrow. The orchard welcomed her with its usual calm, a chorus of sleepy leaves, distant bird murmurs, and the occasional thump of an apple falling without ceremony. She wandered between the rows, brushing her hand against the bark of the trees, each one slightly different in feel, in tilt, in the way they leaned toward or away from the light. She'd grown up under these branches, learned which ones bore fruit first, which ones dropped their apples early out of sheer impatience, and which ones held on to theirs until frost whispered them loose. Her feet knew where the roots rose up to trip the unwary, and where the best shade lingered even on the brightest days. She paused beneath one of the older trees, one that had a hollow near the base, shaped suspiciously like a small loaf of bread, and sat against its trunk with a sigh that didn't quite belong to either sleep or wakefulness. From here, the village was a blur of roofs and rising smoke, the fair now entirely packed away, save for a few forgotten baskets and one wheelbarrow that nobody seemed willing to claim. The pie tent was gone, though a square patch of flattened grass marked its brief reign. She imagined Osbert somewhere in the village, already drafting plans for her to meet a visiting scholar with a reputation for stable calligraphy, or perhaps a merchant's son who had recently acquired a second donkey and a mild case of seasonal confidence. She let the thought pass like a bee too close to the ear. This morning was not for suitors. It was for quiet, for trees, for apples that chose when to fall. She heard a rustle near the fence and turned her head, not startled, just curious. Ulrich stood there, boots damp, holding a small basket that seemed to contain something wrapped in cloth. He looked like someone who had arrived not to disturb, but to offer presents, and perhaps something baked. "I come bearing leftovers," he said, lifting the basket. "And the opinion that morning is better when shared with trees." "You've brought both," she said, motioning for him to sit. He did so, with the same cautious grace, as always, as though unsure whether the grass might suddenly rise up and object. He set the basket between them, opened the cloth, and revealed 2 hand pies, slightly misshapen, but smelling of herbs, and something warmly savory. "Still warm?" she asked. "Warmish," he said. They were intended for breakfast, but became brunch somewhere between the oven and here. She took one bit into it and chewed thoughtfully. It was slightly overstuffed, the crust a bit eager to crumble, but the flavors worked together like old neighbors, familiar, unpretentious, and just a little salty. "You're doing?" she asked. "Mostly," he said, though I was supervised by an aunt with strong opinions and stronger elbows. They ate in silence for a while, the kind of silence that comes easily to people who have already decided not to fill every moment with words. The trees swayed gently. A bird somewhere sang a tune that had too many notes, and the air smelled of apples, damp bark, and the day beginning. I like this, Isolde said eventually. This, Alric asked, wiping crumbs from his thumb. The orchard, the quiet, the not deciding. It feels roomy. He nodded. Not every moment has to be a conclusion. She leaned her head back against the tree, eyes closed. What would happen, do you think, if I just sat here for the next month and refused to speak to anyone about marriage? You'd get excellent at identifying apples by sound alone, he said, and probably receive weekly visits from Osbert with increasingly frantic scrolls. Worth it. The sun was beginning to push through the remaining fog, now turning it gold at the edges, giving the orchard a dreamlike shimmer. One apple fell nearby with a soft thud, ignored by birds and deemed unworthy of commentary by the trees. Isolde didn't move. Neither did Alric. The day, it seemed, was content to begin without requiring them to do anything at all. The sun had climbed higher by the time they left the orchard reluctantly, and only after Alric promised the last hand pie to the tree stump that had silently hosted them. The fog, mostly evaporated, now lingered only in the deepest dips of the land and along the shaded underbrush, like a stubborn houseguest. The village, newly scrubbed by the dew, buzzed softly with the sounds of things returning to normal boots, thudding water buckets, sloshing, and the faint rhythmic tapping of someone hammering something that almost certainly did not need hammering. Isolde and Alric walked side by side, without pretense or purpose, their feet finding the old path that wound along the mill's western edge, a route mostly used by delivery carts, errant geese, and people pretending to be busy. It was a path worn wide enough for too narrow enough to dissuade large livestock, and curiously lined with pebbles that always seemed to rearrange themselves by morning. The mill itself stood off to the left, its broad wooden arms creaking gently as they turned with a kind of lazy defiance, each rotation slower than it needed to be, as if reminding everyone that flour took time and impatience led to lumpy dough. A wheelbarrow passed them, going the other way, pushed by a red-faced boy with a bandage around one thumb and a basket full of unripe pears, each one bouncing like a minor offense. He nodded as he passed, offering no explanation, just the shared recognition that mid-morning was a good time to look like you were delivering something. Have you ever thought about leaving? Isolde asked, not looking at Alric, but rather at a particularly confident butterfly attempting to court a thistle. The village, he asked, the general structure, the plans made for us. The idea that everything happens in order, and if it doesn't, someone writes it down as a cautionary tale. He was quiet for a moment, considering. I've thought about visiting somewhere else, he said. But I've never thought of staying gone. Why not? Because I know where the spoons are here, and which dogs will follow me home, and which baker won't short me on currants if I ask about her garden first. She smiled faintly. So familiarity over freedom? Not always. But sometimes freedom is just unfamiliar inconvenience. That sounds like something Osbert would embroider onto a pillow. He tried. It came out as freedom is just inconvenience in lace. Still accurate. The path narrowed briefly, where the hedgerows leaned in, conspiring over something neither of them bothered to interrupt. They stepped closer, not quite touching, but near enough that Isolde could smell the faintest trace of flour on Alric's sleeve. And he, in turn, could probably smell the lavender that had nestled into the collar of her shawl like a permanent tenant. A small wagon trundled past them, pulled by a pony, with the resignation of someone who had once hoped for a life in theater. The driver, a woman, with a large hat, and an even larger basket of cabbages, waved distractedly. Isolde waved back, though she had no idea who it was. "Do you ever feel like you're being watched?" she asked as they resumed their pace. "Only when I sneeze in public, or walk past Osbert while holding anything round. I mean in general, like the village has eyes. Not cruel, just observant." Alric glanced around. "I think the village is more ears than eyes, listening to who said what, who didn't say enough, and who said it too many times in the wrong tone. So quiet becomes suspicious." "Exactly." They reached a bend in the path where a bench stood beneath an arch of honeysuckle, its seat warped and uneven, its legs firmly committed to differing opinions on balance. Isolde sat first, tucking her skirts beneath her knees, while Alric leaned against the post beside her arms, loosely crossed. "I used to come here to read," she said, tracing a faint crack in the wood with her fingertip. "Before they decided I needed to be useful. Books or scrolls, books mostly, ones about sea trade and maps and ridiculous notions like democracy. Scandalous. And quiet. That was the best part. No one in the village asked if I planned to marry democracy, although I've heard it makes a fine stew if handled properly." She laughed a short, warm sound that caught in her throat and surprised her. He smiled, not broadly, but enough. "Do you want to go back?" he asked, "to reading, to deciding without deciding, to walking around orchards and ignoring scrolls?" She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze drifted up to where a bird landed awkwardly on the edge of the bench's canopy, considered its options, and then departed again without fanfare. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe I want something in between. Something that feels like it's mine, but still smells like bread, and doesn't ask too many questions. You want your own page in the scroll. I want to write it in the margins." He nodded slowly, as if filing that thought away for later, when he had flour on his hands and time to knead something contemplative. The wind stirred the honeysuckle, releasing a scent that was sweet without being insistent. A cloud shifted above them, dimming the sun, just enough to remind them it was still early, yet that the day was not finished with them, and would wait impatiently or otherwise for their next move. Isolde stood brushing the back of her dress, her fingers lingering on the edge of the bench, as if weighing whether to take it with her or simply return someday. Alric pushed off the post, his boots crunching lightly on the gravel. "Walk a bit more," he asked. She nodded. "Just until the road decides to turn again." They stepped forward the path, welcoming their indecision with its usual patience, and the village watching, with its ears listened carefully, but said nothing at all. The road past the honeysuckle bench meandered without urgency, curving past a series of low stone walls and lopsided gates that opened onto gardens in various states of negotiation between order and ambition. Some had rows of vegetables standing at attention like obedient children. Others sprawled with herbs and half-wild berry bushes that had decided boundaries were more of a suggestion. As Isolde and Alric continued their quiet stroll, the village hummed around them in that gentle midday manner, no longer the bustle of early chores, not yet the stillness of afternoon rest, but something in between. The kind of time where bread dough was rising in covered bowls, and people said things like, "just a moment," and meant 15 minutes. Chickens loitered in clusters beside doorsteps, and a cat of suspicious size lounged in a windowsill, as if auditioning for a role it had already claimed. Isolde let her fingers drift along the tops of fence posts as they passed her nails, tracing the faint grooves and weathered splinters, as if searching for something without knowing what. The houses here were smaller, tucked close together, like old friends, each one leaning slightly, as if listening to the one beside it. This part of the village always feels like it's waiting for a secret, she said, glancing at a pair of curtains that twitched a little too quickly when she turned. Probably because it already knows it, Alric replied. It's just waiting for us to catch up. Do you think they talk to each other, the houses? Only in the wind, and mostly about firewood and leaks. They turned down a narrower path, this one less a road, and more a shared understanding between 4 households and a goat. The ground here was more dirt than stone, softer beneath their steps, with small tufts of grass poking through like hopeful intrusions. A group of children played at the far end, engaged in a game involving pebbles, a bent stick, and rules that shifted each time someone lost. One of them, a girl with wild hair and a cape made from a blanket, paused mid-run to stare at them with the solemn curiosity only children can muster. Isolde waved. The girl waved back with the kind of seriousness that suggested this might be a formal alliance. I used to play there, Isolde said once they'd passed. Not with sticks, though. We had spoons. Much more dangerous. Why am I not surprised? They were excellent swords, also good for digging up secrets and occasionally soup. Alric raised an eyebrow. Soup? Sometimes we fought over lunch. It was a complicated time. They emerged from the lane onto a wider path that ran alongside a shallow stream, its banks overgrown with reeds and dotted with flat stones, perfect for sitting or skipping or contemplating things one couldn't say aloud. A willow leaned over the water, its branches grazing the surface in a slow, deliberate pattern that made ripples dance outward in soft, concentric circles. Let's sit, Isolde said, gesturing to a low stone that jutted out beside the stream. Alric joined her, settling beside her, with that careful way he had, as though not entirely convinced the stone wouldn't object. They sat for a while, not speaking, watching the water shift and reflect the sky in fragments. A pair of ducks drifted by with the air of creatures who had somewhere to be, but weren't in a rush to arrive. The silence between them was no longer new. It had become its own presence, soft-edged and companionable, a third thing that neither of them felt the need to fill. I think people assume quiet is empty, Isolde said, eventually, her gaze fixed on a reed bobbing gently. But it's not. It's just not noisy. Some people are uncomfortable without noise, Alric said. It keeps them from hearing what they're actually thinking. Are you ever uncomfortable? Not with you. The words fell into the space between them and didn't echo. They simply settled, like leaves drifting onto the surface of the stream, gentle, steady, without splash or fuss. Isolde didn't respond right away. Instead, she picked up a small stone, weighed it in her palm, then gently tossed it into the water. It landed with a soft plop, sending new ripples across the old ones. I think I could get used to this, she said. The walking, the sitting, the not needing to say anything impressive. I hope you do, Alric said, his voice steady, because I'm not likely to get more impressive. She laughed, the sound surprising them both with how easy it was. Then she turned to look at him, fully eyes, squinting slightly in a brightening light. What do you want? She asked. Not for me. Just in general. He was quiet for a while, not because he didn't know, but because he wanted to answer well. Finally, he said, I want mornings that aren't rushed. A place to bake without someone shouting about crusts. Someone to sit with who doesn't mind if I don't always say the right thing. I want enough, not more, and maybe eventually someone to share that enough with. Isolde looked back at the stream. That's very practical, she said, not poetic at all. You said you preferred it that way. I do. Another silence stretched between them, but it wasn't a pause. It was a continuation. The ducks rounded a bend. The stream murmured something inaudible but soothing. And behind them, the village carried on none the wiser, or perhaps entirely aware, listening, as always saying nothing, yet somehow hearing everything. Eventually, the stream curved away, tugging the ducks along with it, and Isolde rose from the stone, brushing off the back of her dress with a laziness that suggested she wasn't quite ready to return, but understood the concept in theory. Alric stood too slower, as though the rock had grown fond of him, and was reluctant to let go. The path that led them back toward the village bakery was well worn and lined with dandelions doing their best to look purposeful. A cart passed them, pulled by an especially round mule whose ears seemed to disagree about direction. Its driver nodded, chewing something indecisive, and the cart clattered onward, leaving behind the faint scent of onions and mild regret. The bakery, as they approached, was humming not audibly, but with the kind of energy that implied warm ovens, floured surfaces, and someone in the back having a polite argument with a wooden spoon. The air was rich with yeast and toasted grain, a smell so familiar that Isolde nearly closed her eyes from the sheer comfort of it. Alric unlocked the back door with a small brass key he wore around his neck on a string that had once been part of a bootlace. The door opened with a sound that wasn't quite a creak, but more a long-suffering sigh. "You can wait inside," he said, "if you'd rather not be seen," leaving the front holding a mysterious basket and a reputation for long walks. "I think at this point my reputation includes sheep-related disappearances and highly opinionated scarf ownership," she replied, stepping into the warmth. The kitchen was as she remembered it, small, neat and perfumed with flour in every corner. Bowls lined the shelves like sleepy soldiers, and a jar of honey sat beside the hearth with its lid off, as though caught mid-thought. A round loaf sat cooling on a cloth near the window, its crust golden, its shape slightly too ambitious. "Yours?" she asked, pointing. "Mine," he said. "It got optimistic during the second rise. That's how you know it's paying attention." He reached into the cabinet and retrieved a small basket lined with a clean cloth, placing it on the table, with a care usually reserved for newborns or particularly fragile cheese. This, he said, was meant for the midwife, but she canceled. Something about goats and timing, as one does. He lifted the cloth to reveal a small arrangement: 2 rolls, a jar of soft cheese, a sliver of quince jam, and a folded note she could see had her name on it in an unmistakably flour-dusted scrawl. She blinked. "This looks suspiciously like courtship." "It's not," he said quickly, then added, "unless you're in favor of that sort of thing, in which case it's whatever you'd prefer it to be. So it's a conditional, not courtship picnic. That's the working title." She lifted the basket, feeling its weight, a modest offering, humble but considered. She didn't open the note, not yet. She tucked it carefully into her shawl, as though saving it for later, when she could read it under the orchard tree, or beside the stream, or perhaps in bed, with a candle burning low, and no one watching her face for signs. "Thank you," she said, voice quieter now. "I'll think about it. I hope you will." She lingered a moment longer, letting the warmth of the bakery soak in, letting her eyes follow the motion of his hands as he began shaping dough, his movements practiced, patient, precise, in the way only bakers, and those who remember names without being told twice, can manage. She didn't ask what the note said. She didn't need to. The room, the basket, the jam, all of it, was already part of the answer. When she stepped outside, the air felt brighter, the sun higher, and the streets less full of opinions. The village had begun to drift into its afternoon routine. Markets restocking, children drifting home for midday bread, and old men resuming their debates about fence height with renewed indifference. Isolde walked slowly, not toward any particular destination. Her fingers curled around the handle of the basket, the note nestled against her side, like a quiet question she wasn't quite ready to answer. She passed the well where someone had tied a ribbon to the bucket handle, and the notice board, now featuring a new poster with Osbert's unmistakable handwriting about seasonally appropriate companionship and the many benefits of early autumn unions. She smiled without stopping. At the orchard's edge, a breeze rustled the trees in greeting. The basket felt neither heavy nor light, simply present, like a word left hanging in the middle of a sentence, like something about to be decided, but not yet. Not quite. Not today. The orchard was quieter, now touched only by the occasional sigh of wind, passing through leaves and the low hum of bees, unconcerned with human affairs. Isolde walked along the familiar path between rows of trees, the basket swinging gently from one hand, her other brushing the tips of grass that had grown just long enough to whisper back. The spot beneath the old tree, the one with the bread loaf hollow, waited as it always did, half in shadow, half in light, with a patch of moss, so accommodating it seemed almost intentional. She sat down carefully, placing the basket beside her, and removing the note with deliberate fingers, unfolding the creased paper that bore her name in that unmistakably earnest, slightly uneven script. For a long moment, she didn't read it. She simply held it staring past the edge of the orchard to where the village roofs shimmered faintly in the afternoon haze. The sun was not yet low, but the shadows had begun to stretch in that way they do when the day starts leaning toward reflection. Finally, she glanced down and read. The note was short, not flowery or pleading, but sincere. It said something about bread, of course, and about mornings, and about how silence isn't always empty. It spoke of familiarity, and how comfort could be chosen, not settled for. It mentioned a bench near a honeysuckle bush and a stream that listened better than most people. And then, in a line that had been written and scratched out and rewritten again, it said he liked the way she didn't rush to speak, that she paused before answering, that her silence had shape and texture. He said he wasn't asking for a future yet, only a few more mornings, maybe afternoons, possibly a market day if she didn't mind carrying baskets that tilted. Isolde read the note 3 times, then folded it back along its original creases and slipped it into the basket again. She didn't smile exactly, but her shoulders relaxed and her eyes softened, and she leaned back against the tree with the quiet ease of someone who had found a sentence she might like to finish eventually. Above her, the leaves rustled gently, casting flickering shadows on her lap. One apple, overly eager, dropped from its branch and landed with a soft thump beside her boot. She picked it up, turned it in her hands, and set it carefully beside the basket, as though it too might hold meaning. The orchard, never in a hurry, seemed content to let her sit as long as she wished. Somewhere nearby, a sparrow made a sound, like a question it didn't expect answered. Isolde closed her eyes for a moment, not to sleep, just to listen. The breeze carried the faintest echo of village life, someone chopping, kindling the distant clink of glass laughter that trailed off without context. But none of it called to her urgently. The tree held her in place. The earth beneath her felt steady. The note rested quietly beside the cheese and jam. It would not grow cold. It would not spoil. It would wait. She thought, without quite deciding, that perhaps she would walk the long way home this evening. Past the stream again. Past the fence with the gap. Perhaps she'd leave the basket on her table unopened until supper. Or maybe she'd write a reply. Not a letter. Not exactly. Just a sentence or two about how she liked that he didn't ask for answers before the shadows had finished falling. Maybe she'd mention the apple. Maybe she'd say nothing and bring him a loaf instead. The kind with a crust that cracks gently when touched. The kind that says just enough. When Isolde finally rose from the mossy patch beneath the old tree, the sun had slid halfway across its descent, turning the orchard golden at the edges. The shadows stretched longer, now not ominous, just quietly reaching, as if trying to remind everything in sight that endings, like ripened fruit, were inevitable, but not always unwelcome. She lifted the basket carefully, ensuring the apple rested securely against the folded note, and the jar of jam no longer tilted against the roll of cheese. Her shawl, now faintly warmed by the sun, and tinged with the scent of crushed grass, settled over her shoulders like a familiar sentence, trailing off. She walked slowly, not because of weariness, but because the long way home was not meant to be hurried. The path beyond the orchard forked near a low wall of uneven stone, one route leading back to the central square, and its bustle of late errands and passive conversations, the other winding between narrow hedgerows and soft hills dotted with dandelions, too stubborn to acknowledge the season's turning. She chose the latter. This way was older, less traveled, with patches of path where the earth was packed hard by memory alone. Hedges on either side leaned in, as though in quiet conference branches, tangled like gossiping neighbors, sharing a joke too subtle to repeat aloud. A robin darted across the path ahead of her, its red breast catching the light briefly before vanishing into the bramble, and she paused to watch its departure, not for any reason, but because she could. The rhythm of her steps matched the gentle shift of her thoughts, unhurried, low to the ground, with just enough room for what-ifs, and maybe nots. The air had cooled slightly. The earlier warmth softened into something more reflective. The basket's weight felt companionable now, not burdensome, but grounded, as though it too understood that not everything needed to be decided before supper. She passed a gate with no fence, standing alone, like a forgotten idea, and beyond it, a sloped field that once held turnips, and now held nothing in particular. The smell of earth was stronger here, loamy, and full of things that hadn't yet surfaced. A few wildflowers clung to the edges, stubborn and soft. Isolde stopped by a low stump to adjust the scarf at her neck, her fingers pausing briefly on the knot where the cloth folded in on itself. The stillness around her felt more like a companion than a silence now, as if the trees and stones and even the sky had agreed to listen without interpretation. The road curved again, narrowing as it approached a small bridge that spanned a stream much thinner than the one near the willow bench, but equally content in its murmuring. The bridge's stones were worn, smooth, patched here and there, with moss that never took orders from anyone. She paused at the center, looking down at the water that trickled over shallow stones, the current pulling bits of leaf and twig toward places neither urgent nor known. It reminded her of the note in a basket, of the quiet sincerity of its words, of mornings offered rather than claimed. She thought about writing back, not just a reply, but something shaped like a loaf or a shared routine. Not an answer, so much as a continuation. A thread, a line between sentences. She stepped off the bridge and followed the next bend in the path, where the trees began to thin, and the village returned gradually to view rooftops poking out like shy ideas testing the air. Smoke curled from chimneys in lazy spirals, and someone's dog barked at something no one could see. The distant clatter of hooves against cobblestone echoed faintly, then faded again. Her house, when it appeared, did so modestly, its leaning frame outlined in the last of the sun's stretch. The lavender in the window box had begun to dry at the edges, curling slightly, but still holding its scent. She reached the gate, pushed it open with her foot, and walked up the short path to the door. Inside the hall would be warm, the fire likely stirred, and her mother somewhere nearby, pretending not to glance at the clock. But Isolde stood for a moment longer on the step, the basket still in her hands, the breeze catching the edge of her shawl, lifting it like a curtain, just enough to remind her that inside wasn't the only place decisions were made. She turned slightly, just enough to look back at the path behind her, the bend in the road, the hedges that had leaned in the bridge, still holding the weight of someone else's reflection. It all waited patiently. Nothing urgent. Just the continuation of a walk not yet concluded. She stepped inside with the quiet precision of someone not quite ready to be noticed, but too polite to sneak. The warmth hit first a gentle wall of hearth heat, layered with something mildly herby, possibly stew, or an overambitious root mash. The door creaked its usual greeting, and was answered by the faint clink of crockery from the other room. Her mother's voice followed, not loud, but practiced the kind that managed to sound both casual and pointed. "I trust your afternoon involved something resembling sense." Isolde removed her shawl and hung it on the peg, her fingers brushing the folded note, still nestled in the corner of the basket. "No injuries, no arrests," she called back. "I consider that sensible." "And you've returned with cheese?" came the reply now, closer, as Lady Wexley emerged, holding 2 teacups that did not match. She raised an eyebrow at the basket, but said nothing else, simply handed 1 cup to Isolde, who accepted it with a murmur of thanks. They sat in their usual places by the hearth, the chairs angled just slightly toward each other, in that way conversations prefer. The fire crackled with contentment, not roaring, just keeping company. The tea was hot, minty, and almost certainly reused leaves from the morning, but neither of them minded. Lady Wexley sipped, once glanced at the basket, then at her daughter. So she said, "Is this a decision? Or a delay?" Isolde swirled the tea in her cup, watching the small leaf fragments drift like lazy fish. "I'm not sure yet. Maybe it's a conversation that hasn't picked a shape." Her mother nodded, apparently satisfied with ambiguity. "There are worse shapes than bread and jam." "And silence," Isolde added. "That too." Outside, the last of the daylight had softened into that silvery gray that made everything look briefly older. The fire popped, sending a small spark upward that fizzled before it landed. Isolde reached into the basket and removed the apple, turning it slowly in her hands. "He didn't ask for anything," she said finally. "Not really. But he offered yes. Sometimes that's the better part." They sat for a while, without more words, letting the clink of cup against saucer and the occasional whistle from the kettle fill in the space where thoughts were still arranging themselves. The note remained untouched for now, though Isolde could feel its presence like a warm stone in her pocket. Not heavy, just waiting. Eventually, her mother rose, collected the empty cups, and said something about checking the stew before it turned judgmental. Isolde remained by the fire, alone now, her fingers tracing the ridges of the apple skin. The basket rested beside her, humble and content. and the room flickering gently with firelight offered no opinions. Just quiet. Just room enough for thinking. Later that night, long after the tea had cooled and the stew had been declared both edible and comforting in its intent, Isolde sat in her small room beneath the slightly slanted beams and the slow creak of a house, remembering how to settle. The basket now rested on the edge of her table, one corner of the cloth folded back where she had removed the apple and placed it carefully on her windowsill, as if to observe the night with her. A single candle flickered beside her, the flame leaning just enough to suggest the presence of a draft, but not committed enough to go out. She had unwrapped the note again, not to reread it, but to smooth its folds and tuck it into the blank side of an old book of herb uses and household remedies, wedging it between entries about lavender sleep sachets and the improbability of time. It wasn't hidden exactly. It had simply found a quieter place to wait. Her fingers brushed the spine of the book, then paused, then rested on the tabletop. The room smelled of old paper drying mint and wool that had done its best. She had not made a decision in the way some did with proclamations and fanfare, but something within her had shifted gently, like flour settling in a bin. She reached for the cloth-wrapped loaf. Its crust crackled just slightly with time, but still giving beneath her fingers. She unwrapped it slowly, not out of hesitation, but reverence, then sliced a single piece with the care of someone raised to believe in the importance of even cuts. The bread still held warmth at its center. She set it on a small plate beside the cheese and opened the jam jar with a quiet twist. The spoon she chose had a bent handle, familiar, and unbothered by its flaw. She spread jam first, then cheese, an order her mother would have lightly disapproved of, but which she found gave a better texture. The bite she took was small and thoughtful, followed by another, slightly less so. She chewed slowly, letting the flavors settle. The loaf was simple, the crust a little firmer than the bakery's best, the center tender, the balance of salt and yeast precise in its humility. It was not extraordinary. And that was the point. It was the kind of bread you could share in silence without needing to name anything. She sat back, with the last bite still resting on her tongue, her eyes drifting to the window, where the orchard shadows now blended fully into the night. Somewhere out there, she imagined Alric was folding linens, or wiping down counters, or staring at an empty mixing bowl, thinking about whether he'd said too much or not enough. She hoped he knew it had been enough. She reached for a fresh scrap of paper and dipped her pen into ink without any rush. The words came slowly, without ornament. A line or two about apples, about silence, about bread that didn't need improving. She left space at the bottom, not for a signature, but for whatever came next. Then she folded the page, tucked it beneath the edge of the cloth on the basket, and stood. The candle flickered once as she passed the air shifting with her movement. Outside, the night held its breath as if curious. She stepped onto the path barefoot, her shawl wrapped tight, the basket in hand, and the road ahead, waiting in its usual unassuming way.